So, I got a video response to make to James Butler's video that he just put out. It is May 1st, 2024. And the video is named, What If You're Wrong? Alright? So, James, I've got an alternative perspective to go ahead and propose to you. Alright? So, you were talking about the feeling that ends up coming along with being wrong, and that it rarely ever, if ever, is a good feeling. Not necessarily. Alright? So, you see right there? That's a part of my skull that ended up getting caved in. Alright? I deal with the long-term effects of it on a constant basis. To be blunt with you, I shouldn't have been able to survive. Alright? So, when talking about arguing, talking about taking accountability, responsibility, the factor that very few people go ahead and look at, which ends up being the nuance between people that have survived trauma, people that have had to endure a plethora of hardships, or people that have never had to endure any hardships to be able to even gain the ground to just be able to exist. Alright? So, when most people argue, they argue because they're so self-assured that they're right. That's not the reason I argue. Do you know the reason I argue? Because I understand how easy it is to be wrong on so many different levels. But there's a saying, I'm pretty sure you've heard of it. To err is to be human. Now let me ask you this. How much of a reminder and how much of a good reminder would it be to be reminded that you're human? Because there was a point in time where you didn't even have the assurance of being alive. You see the way that my head caves in? Right there. Ultimately, for me, when I argue, it's not to argue to debate. It's to go ahead and take on all the nuances and perspectives that end up coming along with what made a person originally take the stance that they did, the amount that they've actually absorbed as far as the nuances, and also being able to go ahead and, at the end of it all, be able to say, I know this has been time consuming. I know this has been emotionally and mentally exhausting. But I wanted to make sure that any and every potentiality ended up going ahead and getting covered in the process of debating and talking, to go ahead and find out where the weak point is, Because, ultimately, when it comes down to the difference between efficiency and inefficiency, there always tends to be that thin nuance that ends up going ahead and being the determining factor. So, for example, when it comes down to the whole, couldn't, do the septic tank because of having to move bushes and everything. And then volunteering their, partner services, as far as legal. No. Understand. When somebody's on a power trip and they think they've got all the control in the situation, it's like, hey, so if your weapon of choice is sex, it's kind of hard to be able to go ahead and weaponize sex against somebody who, literally ended up going years without sex, just to make the fucking point of, if you think that's the way to be able to control the narrative and control the situation, you literally could have picked anybody in the world, anyone else in the world, and you might have had a success rate, a potential success rate. So how does that work with me? All right. Number two, when somebody has a history of trying to stir up trouble and try to mince words, twist the narrative, ultimately, the only time that they ever go ahead and readjust and pivot is when there is economic potential to go ahead and benefit. So ultimately, trying to pretty much pit one parent against another, that method doesn't really work well. And keep in mind, I'm making the metaphor of like, you're going to be childish. I'm going to go ahead and compare, your actions and the circumstance that you went to go instigate to being childish. And I'm going to treat you like a child. But also, ultimately, when you end up going ahead and having a circumstance, like, for example, somebody trying to contractually entrap you and coerce you by, like, for example, trying to send a quote-unquote 51-page contract, but only give the packets in part. It's like, yeah, no, there's not a court that'll view this as conscionable, because ultimately the first question is going to end up getting asked is, all right, if there was no attempt on contractual entrapment or, for example, predatory, practices as far as charging, or price gouging, then how come you're so afraid to go ahead and have every page, one after another, lined up on a table for it to be read all at once? And the answer is, whenever somebody goes and tries to handle the situation in that manner, they know for a fact they do not have a leg to stand on. So, in that circumstance, understand, when somebody goes and makes a threat like that, and it's like, nah, I'm going to go ahead and stake my partner's professional reputation on this. That's that moment that you go ahead and say, listen, this is unconscionable. Ultimately, you ended up going ahead and deciding to play chicken with an oncoming train. You rolled out the red carpet to it. Let me move out of the way so you can go ahead and get hit with the consequences of your own actions. I think you understand a thing or two about that. But ultimately, when it comes down to being wrong or willingness to be wrong or willingness to learn, when there are already too many instances that you should not have survived, being wrong is a nice change, because of the factor that being wrong means you have an opportunity to learn something new, and it may even end up piquing your interest a hell of a lot more than you ever thought it would. So, ultimately, it all boils down to that saying, a master has failed more times than the predecessor has even tried. But philosophy, going and being applied in modern day. Am I wrong? If you feel like it, go ahead and reach out.